Okay, let's move into cluster B disorders, which starts off on page 659 in your DSM. Cluster B is the most popular and common personality disorders. It's the ones you've most likely heard about. There's a good chance you've heard a lot about some of these, and so I'm not going to spend much time about the cluster. It's also the cluster that is in some ways not the most clearly connected of them. In my opinion, there's almost like uh, there's almost two clusters in a cluster here at cluster B. There's four disorders, but the clusters here are interesting. They end up having relationships with people that are like the relationship to people in these disorders is uh, shallow and extreme. So that is like the connective fiber that in extreme in good and like in multiple bad ways, multiple bad ways I would say, or multiple problematic ways I would say. So I want to jump into these because you're likely to know a lot of them. And it starts with the one that I would suspect you're most familiar with, which is antisocial personality disorder. So this is probably either the most or the second most researched personality disorder. And I think I'll say more about why I think that is after we go through it. But this has also gone through its own series of changes about how we understand this construct, like this particular personality type. But it has evolved over time from um, like sociopathy, like a person being a sociopath. We really like went away from the term sociopath or sociopathy and moved into antisocial personality. But to be quite honest, the sensibility of it is not all that different. And so if you've got a familiarity what a sociopath is, I would sort of match that to what you hear me talking about and see if you've got a good understanding. So here we're looking at a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. So let's just pause there. Disregard for and violation of the rights of others. So don't don't really care about your rights. Don't really care about not only don't care about it, but I will violate it as well. Occurring since the age of 15. So this is a disorder that you do see the roots of in adolescence. And when we talk about this semester conduct disorder is sometimes a precursor to this even earlier than adolescence. So there does appear to be a lot of evidence out there that the developmental course of antisocial personality characteristics are um, maybe long standing developmentally. So you have to have three of the following seven of these traits of pervasive disregard for people's rights: failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior, as indicated by repeated performing acts that are grounds for arrest. So, like, to simplify it, breaking the law. Two, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. It's important to hear both of those: personal profit or pleasure. Maybe you're doing it just because you like doing it. People with antisocial personality will lie just for fun. Like, they will con people just for fun. They will deceive people just for fun, but also for profit or money or both. What's better, having fun and getting paid while you do it, right? Uh, Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. This is actually one of the more overlooked traits. Sometimes we think of people with antisocial personality as being calculating, and while some of them can be calculating, the overwhelming majority are not. The overwhelming majority are impulsive. They will just be driving down the interstate and decide to floor it 100 miles an hour and turn off their headlights. See what happens. Uh, and that connects to this next trait here: reckless disregard for the safety of self and others. Self is important there. Again, I think sometimes we have this notion. I think TV shows like Criminal Minds sometimes gives us this notion of these like super intelligent, super calculating people, and that is such a small, little, tiny baby sliver of the folks who actually are diagnosed with this. Most of these folks will just as readily harm themselves as somebody else. And so, my example of driving 100 miles an hour on the interstate with your lights out, you could absolutely kill yourself as easily as somebody else. But there is no sense of regard for the law, one, the safety of others, two, and the safety of self, three. So, I mean, that example is helpful in that, and it's impulsive, so that's kind of a helpful example. Consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. That's a really nice way of saying can't keep a job and can't pay their bills. I'm just trying to simplify this for us all so that we're not watching 6 hours of videos here. And a lack of remorse, which I often think of as the hallmark symptom here. A lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing hurting, mistreated, or stolen from somebody. Well, I stole because they deserved it. They're rich. They don't need that. Oh, they're rich. They'll buy a new car. Who cares if I stole their car? You know, that's like the rationalizing of it. Some people with antisocial personality don't even bother to rationalize it. They just don't care that they did it. So you can see either one of those clinical presentations, either one of those types of approaches would check the box of criteria A7. So you're looking for three or more of these out of 7. And again, if you're kind of keeping score at home, this is a difficult person. You know, this is like the uncle that never has a job, bounces back and forth with different people, constantly conning women into dating him and staying with him, stealing from them, writing hot checks, getting kicked out, domestically violating her, beating, abusing. Um, yeah, so these are difficult characters for sure. You can imagine that from a treatment perspective, they almost only show up because they are mandated to. The majority of our access to people with antisocial personality is through the criminal justice system. They usually are court ordered to come into services, which makes sense. So, I think one of the reasons they are so researched is because we have access to them in the criminal justice system. You know, the overwhelming majority of studies on people with antisocial personality have come from psychologists who work in prison settings. And so and so I think that's one reason we know a lot about them. I think the other reason we know a lot about this, and this is actually a more optimistic reason, is that I do think mental health professionals are more serious about rehabilitation. I'm just going to be like brutally honest. I don't think many people think that jails and prisons are actively working to rehabilitate people. I do think that mental health people believe that people can be rehabilitated. So I think the other reason there has been a lot of dedicated science to antisocial personality is for the rehabilitation part of it. Like, is there a way, and if so, how can we get these folks to be more law abiding, to care more about the safety and welfare of others, to stop violating the rights of people, or the property of people. So I think there has been a lot of attention for that reason too, because if we understand the disorder better, maybe we can treat that. It's a difficult disorder to treat, with that said, and certainly takes a lot of specialty work. It's something that I don't work with at all. I wouldn't work with it. It's not an area where I'm trained in. It's got one of the higher prevalence rates, as you can imagine. Um, and the highest prevalence of antisocial personality is among most severe samples of males with alcohol use disorder or substance abuse issues. So you often see comorbid substance concerns with these folks, which is really scary because the best case scenario is maybe certain drugs calm all this energy down, but that is not usually what happens. Usually, drugs and alcohol. This person is already really uninhibited, obviously. Drugs and alcohol can just crank that dial up. So, um, the other place that we see these folks is in like drug and alcohol treatment facilities, and they tend to be the least effective. They tend to manipulate staff. They tend to manipulate their fellow peers in those facilities. So it's a difficult disorder with a chronic course, and Yeah. Moving on to 663, borderline personality disorder. I feel like there's also a chance folks have heard of this one before, although I frequently find this to be a misdiagnosed one. I think this can look like other sort of things clinically. I would also suspect this has been the most researched, and that makes me think that it probably has the highest prevalence rate, and also there's some real interesting characteristics of people who have a borderline personality that's developed. So here the pervasive pattern is instability of interpersonal relationships. So we're going to really think about these one by one. Instability of interpersonal relationships. So that's not bad interpersonal relationships. It's unstable. It's instability in them. So these are folks who have, call it what you want, hot and cold, on and off, pedestal and off the pedestal types of relationships. Which, as you probably know from a personal standpoint, like those things can last for a long time. People can be in these really very dramatic relationships. Instability of self-image. So at times can love themselves and love what they see in the mirror and love who they are and think they're amazing. And at other times hate themselves, hate everything about themselves. So a very unstable self-image. And instability of affect. So, and when I say instability of affect, I do mean this. You may remember in bipolar disorder, I said that was episodic. So you might see a whole episode of mania where people, their affect can be unstable. This is pervasive and chronic. So this is more common, the sort of like 1 minute, I'm fine, I'm great, I'm happy, and the next minute, I'm terrible. I'm down in the dumps. I've never been sadder. I'll never feel as much pain in my life. And 20 minutes later, I'm so in love with you. So very severe instability of affect. So you got instability in the interpersonal relationships, in the affect, and in the self-image. And then impulsivity on top of that in those same domains. So once you see that pattern, you're then, in order to be like, okay, I'm seeing that pattern, you're then going to look at the next 9 criteria, and you need to have at least 5 of these. 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Oftentimes, abandonment fears are the hallmark of borderline personality. If you ask them, what is the worst thing that can happen to you? Everyone leave me. What is the worst possible outcome for you? Have nobody in my life. What is the worst pain you've ever felt in your life? Being abandoned, right? So generally the abandonment themes are very strong. And I should note, frantic efforts to avoid this. So I'll do anything to not make you leave me. And this is really where you see that instability of affect and interpersonal relationships. So like imagine in a relationship, you're having a huge fight and I hate you. You're the worst. You're the worst person I've ever met. I wish I would have never met you. The worst day of my life was the day that I met you. And then you say to that person, you know what? You're right. I'm out. No, 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 no. Don't do this. Don't leave me. I can't live without you. You can't go. I'm nothing without you. I'll die. I'll kill myself. Right? So the second the threat of abandonment, that is an example of it being real, but it could also be imagined. That threat makes the person behave very impulsively and unpredictably in order to avoid that abandonment. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by extremes of ideation and devaluation. So let's think about this one through what it's saying. Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. I'm already really describing that in my examples here. So, when it's good, it's amazing. And when it's bad, it's never been worse. That is the idea of extreme ideation. They come into session 1 week. I met this guy. I believe in soulmates now. He is my everything. I've never felt so connected. I've never been in love so much. And the next week in therapy to come in, he is a piece of shit. He is the worst person I ever dated. No one's ever hurt me as bad as he has hurt me. What happened? Oh, like he stopped texting me back. All right, got it. Extreme, unstable, devaluation, idealization. Um, and by the way, that theme will play out in your counseling relationship with them. So one week you are, oh, I've seen 20 therapists. No one's ever been as good as you. You're so smart. You get it. No one's ever cared about me this much. And then first time you challenge them, they disappear for a month. And then they finally come back. I wasn't going to come back and see you. Oh, really? What was going on? Well, I, I think I'm too complicated for you. I don't think you get it. I mean, it's no offense, like I'm sure you're a very smart person, I'm sure, but like, I'm just like really complicated and I'm really deep and I just I get the sense that you can't really connect to me or relate to me because of just how smart I am. It's like, okay, got it. Maybe you're right. Impulsivity in at least two areas that are potentially self damaging. So, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. But these do not include suicidal ideation or self mutilating. They are their own criteria. So, impulsivity in self destructive, self damaging ways. So, excessive spending, excessive sex. This is the one that can really look like a manic episode. You have to rule out a manic episode here. Five, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self mutilation. Notice here the language suicidal behaviors, gestures, or threats. Those are all actions. It's not actually saying there a desire to die, it's saying a threat to kill yourself, a what's the language here? A gesture that you're going to kill yourself, like cutting yourself, or a behavior, um, like passive aggressively being like, hey, are all like you just got all your refills, right? Like you've got 90s day worth of pills in the bathroom, right? Yeah, why? No, I mean, I just wanted to know like if there were like a lot of pills in there or just like not a lot of pills. And say that's happening like right after a fight, for example, right? That's like a suicidal gesture or behavior. Affective instability due to marked reactivity of mood. So that is very fancy language for saying their emotions are up, down, and all around, and they are markedly reactive. If you remember, like mood reactivity when we talked about mood episodes, that's like when a person's really depressed, but then you bring puppies and they're like, I love puppies, right? So imagine really extreme impulsive version of mood reactivity. That's what it's talking about here. So intense episodic dysphoria, like intense episodic. I've never felt worse before in my life, but then it goes away. Or anxiety that usually lasts a few hours and rarely more than a few days. True mood conditions, true anxiety conditions don't just go away in 12 hours. And one of the ways you differentiate this from a mood disorder, from bipolar or depression, is if you're in a mood episode, you're looking at days. If it's depression, you're looking at weeks. But if it's mania, you're looking at a week, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. This is talking about that person that they leave work early because their mom texted them she wasn't coming over and they've never felt more abandoned in their entire life and they're scared they'll never talk to her again and they're so distressed they have to go home from work. They go home from work and cry for 4 hours, but then later when their boyfriend comes over for a movie, they're totally fine. Right? That's sort of the notion that's spelling. Chronic feelings of emptiness. So when you really begin to explore these people, they will begin to tell you like they feel totally empty inside. They're so vulnerable to their environment that really they can seem like a chameleon in some ways, but really they just feel empty inside. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. So again, my examples are already kind of spelling this out. Like they'll get into fights, they'll scream, they'll yell, their temper will flare off, and it's very intense when it happens. And then lastly, transient stress related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So, I would say particularly depersonalization, derealization, like those dissociative types of symptoms, or transient stress-related paranoia. So like they're so overwhelmed with fear and anxiety about someone leaving them that they begin to have like some weird paranoia. That's what this will be talking about there. If you're saying to yourself, wow, that person seems like a lot, the answer is most people in their lives experience them that way too. And if you're saying to yourself, how do they have all these relationships? Like, how do they even get these relationships to then have these concerns in them? I actually think that's a great question to ask. And the answer is, listen, I'm partly to blame for this. I'm explaining the bad end of this deal, the problematic end, the extreme angry, the extreme intense, the extreme fearful. But they have the same version of all those things on the other end. So while they can be so difficult, for example, to have a fight with because all their fears about being alone, being abandoned come out on full display, they can also be really fun, really charming, really charismatic. Don't forget the part I said earlier that when it's good, it's great. With these folks, when it's good, it's great. And so when they're in a good space, when they're in a good headspace, when things are going well, they are really, really fun. They can be really endearing. They can be really charming. They can be really engaging. And that can really draw people in. The problem is it drops on a dime. And so people who often are with them are like, God, like people who date folks with borderline personality, for example, will say, gosh, it's like kind of a minefield. As long as I am tiptoeing around avoiding the mines, it's really awesome. But if I hit a mine, it's bad. It's really bad. That is like a very common thing that people who are partnered or dating people with borderline personality will say is that there is this perpetual sense of like I have to walk on eggshells. But over time, if people stick it out with them, it can actually end up changing to a feeling of being jaded because what they also learn over time is this person's not really going to leave me. They're not really going to kill themselves and they're not really going to leave me. These are things they do just to like get attention from me and to make me tell them I'm not going to leave them. And so then they can begin just to kind of like roll through the minefield because they don't care anymore. Like, in their opinion, like the level of extreme reaction that they end up having is like the extreme reaction that they have is almost like par for the course, and so they can be not taken very seriously. That is actually one of the things that often gets these folks into therapy. It's like, I'm in this marriage and my husband just doesn't get me. He doesn't understand me. He does all these things, and those things are like the landmines, He does all these things that affect me. He doesn't even care anymore. I don't think he even loves me. You can see where that kind of thing showing up at your door, you wouldn't think borderline personality at first. You'd be like, oh, gosh, this person, like, maybe they're in a bad marriage. Maybe they're in a crappy marriage. So what do? A lot of empathy, a lot of support. And then all of a sudden, over time, you're like, wait a minute. These traits seem like they're present everywhere. And I'm only hearing about the fights that they have that are extreme that I think feel more justified. What I'm not hearing about are like the little things like, wait, you and your mom also fight like this? Wait, you and your dad fight like this? Wait, you and your first husband had this problem? Wait, you've had how many jobs in the past 10 years that you got fired for because of your anger? Right? Like you begin to put the puzzle together. So even though I'm painting to you a very dramatic, extreme example of this, these folks exist in all ways, shapes, and forms, and they're in all kinds of environments. And it often does take time to begin to put the full picture together about who these folks are. And because during that time, when they're good, they're great, they're mostly probably reading to you as charming or funny, and then they're getting your connection and you're liking them and you're building a friendship with them. And then you do that, and once you do that, that's when they begin to drop their guard and you see the other parts of it. But by then, you're a little bit invested. So these folks are really interesting characters to work with because it can take a while to see the traits, and everyone in their life is a part of these themes. And so you will also become part of these themes. Oftentimes, as counselors, we don't really see this, so we don't really feel people with borderline personality until the instability and extreme emotionality hits us. Like when we are receiving it and clients, we're like, oh, this is that thing. The last one in cluster B is on page 667, which is histrionic personality disorder. You might say, wow, this is the shortest of all those boxes. It's not a coincidence it's the shortest of all these boxes. It's the shortest because it's the most shallow of all of these. So if you look here, a pervasive pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking beginning in early adulthood in a variety of contexts by 5 of the following 8. So they have to have 5 of 8, which is a pretty large chunk. But look here, the pervasive pattern you're looking for is extreme emotionality and attention seeking. 2 big characteristics. For people with histrionic personality, you can almost guarantee that all of their behaviors are motivated around attention. So 1 is uncomfortable in a situation if they are not the center of attention. So as a result of that, they will do whatever it takes to get that attention back. So if they're like in a bar and they're getting a lot of attention at first, but then people start to talk to other people, move away, then they'll get up on the table and start dancing, and then they get some attention back. And then when the attention begins to go away, they get on the table and take their shirt off and start dancing, right? So like every time the attention begins to move away, they get more and more uncomfortable with that, and then their behavior begins to go in suit to that. 2, interaction with others is usually inappropriate, sexually seductive, or provocative. So like they're oftentimes the way they interact with you is to provoke you or to be sexually seductive. And so these people are usually pretty overtly sexual. They use their sexuality as a way to get attention. And if that's not working on you, so like, for example, if you are the same gender person or not matching the sexuality where that interests you, then they will use provocation. Sorry, it took me a minute to get to that word. They'll use provocation to get to you, to get the attention. Displays rapidly shifting and shallow expressions of emotions. You're my everything! I hate you! Like truly, like in a 30-second span of time, that is the trait that kind of links it to borderline personality, is that impulsive, shifting instability. But here there is a lack of depth to it. Consistently uses physical appearance to draw attention to themselves. These folks, in females, will not walk out of the house without full face, full hair, all the makeup, all the hair, best outfit, short outfits, lots of cleavage, lots of legs. For male identified people, they often are usually gym rats because they need their body to look attractive, and so they're very fit, very muscular. Same thing, hair perfect. If they have facial hair sculpted perfect, like these are the men that you see in the mirror every day with clippers, making sure every little hair on their face and body is perfect and done. So they really will use their physical appearance to make sure they get attention. Has an excessively impressionistic style of speech that's also lacking in detail. So this is an interesting phraseology. Excessively impressionistic and lacking in detail. So when they're talking, it feels big, but there's nothing to it. So, like imagine it like a work lunch, like a luncheon. Maybe they're, who does luncheons anymore? Chamber of Commerce, right? So like at a Chamber of Commerce luncheon, they're like, just being big and loud and funny, but they're not really saying anything or contributing anything. It's a big part of like their presentation. Shows self-dramatization, theatricality, and exaggerated expression of emotion. Again, big, dramatic, theatrical. I mean, they use the word theatrical here in the DSM. Theatricality is suggestible, so easily influenced by others or by circumstances. This person will go with the flow, because going against the flow means people aren't going to be with you, So like, if everyone's like, let's keep it going, let's all go to the park and, woo, party. Even if they do not want to go, they will go, because if they don't go, then they'll have no attention. So they're pretty suggestible. And then they consider relationships to be more intimate than others, or than they actually are. So sort of imagine, like, oh my gosh, like I have I remember a woman from college that was like in our friend group. In hindsight, I didn't know what this was at the time, but in hindsight, definitely had histrionic characteristics, if not fully the personality. But the thing about her, I remember very seductive, very sexually seductive, very dramatic, theatrical. If you were in a room with her, you knew she was in the room with you. You knew she was in the room with you. Uh, got kicked out of several classes in college because she would make such a display that professors really hated her. But the thing I remember about her was this criteria 9 or 8, whatever the last one is, where they see relationships as more intimate. She would So we lived in the same little area or whatever. So it was like a group of 5 or 6 of us, and it was, no joke, every 2 weeks she had found the love of her life. This person was her soulmate. They were her everything. They were her omega and her alpha. They were her yin and her yang. They were all of it. Yin to her yang. They were everything. And then, I went to a relatively small campus, 15,000 people or whatever. And so people knew each other, and you would come across the guy, and you say oh, I heard you are hanging out with Ashley, and he's like, oh, who? Ashley, and you describe her oh yeah, yeah, I heard you two were kind of serious, and the guy's like, seriously what? You're serious. She thinks you're her soulmate. You shared your deepest, darkest fears and fantasies. You talked about what you want your kids to be like. And the guys always would be like, oh, we just literally hooked up. You have to remember I'm old before texting, so who even knows what she would have been like in the texting world. But we didn't have cell phones in undergrad, but it's no, we hooked up. It was cool. And it took only a few months to kind of figure out wait a minute. But